this was my identity.
Nobody talks about how freaking hard it is to be a dentist. What most people talk about is how this affects the patient. What nobody talks about is how this affects us. Dentistry is ready for this. Now is really the time. Welcome back to Wellness in Dentistry. I am one of your co-hosts, Dr. Kyle Stanley. I'm a dentist, tech entrepreneur, speaker, and a researcher. And I'm joined by your other co-host and my very good friend, Dr. Martin Mendelson. He is a disabled dentist, coach, speaker, thought leader, and author. And together we've helped thousands of dental professionals pursue wellness in dentistry. And if you'd like to join us on this mission, on this journey, make sure to join us at our Lightside Live event, which is May 9th and 10th. That is in Irvine, California. It's a 2-day CE event. You get 12 CE credits. It's at Glidewell Dental Lab. It is our most transformational in-person course that we give. So you can go to wellnessindentistry.com, click on our links, and you'll be able to find everything there. Now today, Martin and I are going to talk about what's happening in dentistry. And what do we mean by that? We mean what's happening with the shift in dentistry on mindset, what's happening with CE, what's happening with sales, what's happening on the corporate side. Martin and I are lucky enough to travel around the world and speak and consult on different things. So I feel like we bring a fairly comprehensive global vision of what is happening in dentistry. And we're recording this at the end of February when Martin was just at Midwinter in Chicago. I was speaking at an artificial intelligence in dentistry event in Omaha, Nebraska. He and I are both going to be speaking. I think you're going to Texas. I'm going to Atlanta in the next week or so. So Martin, tell me what's happening in dentistry?
That's a loaded question.
I know that's a general question.
Yeah. So I think it's a confluence of a number of different things. Let's in my head, Kyle, the mental wellness thing versus the business thing are a little bit separated. So maybe we can talk about the business stuff first, if you will.
Okay.
So, if you go to a meeting like Midwinter, which is an absolutely fantastic meeting, one of the preeminent meetings, one of the largest meetings, if you've never been to Chicago Midwinter before, it's not just at the convention center called McCormick Place. It's Lab Day. It's the Restorative Academy. It's the Operative Academy. Like, we literally take over the city. Like,
Take over Chicago.
Yeah, it's not an exaggeration either. It's a pretty close statement. But yet, at the same time, certain elements are starting to shrink. So although Midwinter is still one of the largest meetings, if you go to the exhibit hall, it's slightly smaller than it was, let's say, back in '07 when I first started on the corporate side. But I think the biggest shift is the presence of the individual corporations. Because for many of them, their footprint, their booth size is smaller. And there's a multitude of reasons for that. Internet sales, the ability of information, because don't forget, Midwinter, this was their 160th meeting.
Wow.
And so
That's crazy.
yeah. So 160 years ago, you had to go to a convention to find out about new dental materials. Today, you don't need to do that. And so part of the shrink in the footprint of various companies has a lot to do with, social media, the internet, technology, et cetera. But there's other stuff too.
I think
What have
COVID
you
had
noticed
something to do with this too.
Oh yeah.
I see a few things happening with during COVID, after COVID. Of course, during COVID, it was really challenging to have in-person events. Afterwards, they struggled to come back, but then I did see them come back with a vengeance.
Yeah.
People were yearning for that in-person experience with other humans in the room. And so it's funny now that we're a few years after the COVID crisis, still around, but it's funny to see that dip a little bit. I
Yeah.
started to see some of this right before COVID too, like 2019 with some of the implant companies that I was working with. I remember the first time when they weren't it was some big meeting, and I was like, wait, you're not going to be there? And they're
Yeah.
like, yeah, it's
Yeah.
our first
Yeah.
year not doing that.
Well, but to contrast, I went over to LMT Lab Day and spent a half day over there. And that was in terms of people per square footage, that was busier than Midwinter was.
That's
And
interesting.
there were several implant companies, speaking of implant companies, that were only at Lab Day that weren't at Midwinter. And
Hmm.
so part of the reason why we're seeing this shift has a lot to do with ROI because the expenditures have gone up and up and up. That's no secret to anybody.
Yeah.
And so the dental companies then have to decide how many representatives are we going to bring in? That's expensive for flights and hotels and food and per diem. And so it would appear that certain companies, particularly some larger implant companies, felt that the ROI was more significant at Lab Day than it was at Chicago Midwinter.
Let's
Because,
talk about labs because we know that the lab market is consolidating,
yep,
just like
yep,
how the dental practice market is consolidating, right? You're having
correct.
less, and I'm the clinical director of a lab, so I work in this industry too. Is that 10 years ago, I don't know what the numbers are, but let's say there were hundreds of labs.
Hmm.
Now it may be that there's like less than 100 labs. I mean, th those numbers may not be correct, but it's significantly
Yeah,
decreased. You
yeah,
don't have as much of the 1 to 5 person boutique
correct,
lab. And I
correct.
think that same thing is happening in the dental world too. You don't have as much as the of those single operator owner practices.
Hmm. And I think with Lab Day in particular, you're absolutely right. The lab shrunk. In fact, back in the day when I was with Vita on the lab side, I remember when the Great Recession hit, they had, and I think these numbers are pretty damn close. There was somewhere like 12,000 labs ish before 2007, and by the end of 2009 or 10, it was like 5,600. It was pretty
Wow.
significant. And
Wow.
so maybe my top end number is a little too high. Maybe it was like 10 and it went down to
But
like,
either way, we can just say a
yeah.
percentage, like
But
reduced
what I
by
think
40% in
people
a few years.
Yeah. But what I think people forget though is just because there was consolidation of the companies providing services, that didn't mean that there was a shrink in humans, i.e., the demand is still there. So, you may have fewer clients, let's say you're Straumann or Nobel, you might have fewer numbers of clients on the lab side. However, their share of wallet, their spend with you per client is going up because it's not like the number of humans needing crowns has shrunk or, well, we won't go there because of in-office CAD CAM, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
And so,
You and I have both been on the corporate side, and I want to just make sure that our listeners know just how much a booth costs.
oh my gosh,
Like
it's insane.
if you are an Ivoclar or a Dentsply or a Line or any of
Yeah.
these large implant companies, for example, I mean you may spend $500,000 on a booth.
Yeah, it's insane because it's not just the booth, which is very expensive because it's all basically custom. It's paying the laborers to load in and load out the booth. They don't let you just come in and set it up yourself because of
Yes.
unions and so forth. Then you have to add in the product that's displayed at the booth. Then you have to add in the personnel at the booth relative to travel and hotel and food and oh, and then let's us not forget that many of these companies use these larger scale events like Chicago to connect with their customer base. So they'll throw fancy schmancy parties to the tune of
Dinners,
another
parties.
20, 30, $50,000.
Hmm.
And so it becomes cost prohibitive for almost any company that's below a certain threshold in size. Because there are some companies that I saw at Midwinter, they'll remain nameless, that used to have big booths that now had 8-foot tables.
Do you have any idea or a feeling, if you don't know any numbers, on how the attendance was? Did it feel crowded? Did it feel less than normal?
No, Midwinter felt great. I'm using my experience and, I went to Midwinter 12 years in a row and I haven't been there in the recent past. So for me, I think I'm observant enough that I was like, no, this used to be out a little bit farther, but I can tell you Midwinter, CDA in California in particular have done quite well. And in fact, I heard as recently as about last year that Midwinter, in terms of their attendance, is up to pre-COVID levels, which doesn't surprise me. It was
That's
it
great to
was
hear.
packed. Yeah, it was pretty packed. As was Lab Day, as I said. I think Lab Day feels more packed because of the size of the
It's smaller,
venue
yeah.
versus a big exhibit hall. But if you look at the number of courses and what they offer, which can kind of lead us into the mindset stuff, it's just as comprehensive as it ever was. And you know, first of all, shout out to the people at Midwinter and Dr. Cheryl Mora and all of the board. I mean, they're fantastic people and they're really invested to make this a great experience for everybody. And I can tell you as a speaker, I felt very well taken care of. And it's really a service to the profession, particularly for the docs that either are local or choose to fly their teams in. Because I was on the shuttle bus with a team from Tennessee
Wow.
where they're using it as a practice team building
Event.
experience as well
Mhm.
as being able to learn CE and so forth. So,
Well, I think what people need to remember is US dentistry is really hubbed in Chicago.
yeah.
With the ADA being there, whatever you think
Yep.
about the ADA, and I have mixed feelings on the ADA. Sometimes I think they're great. Sometimes I think that
Mhm.
they're not so great. But,
Yeah.
that Chicago is a dentistry city. My dad
Yeah.
went to dental school there. With the ADA being there, it is like the center of, I don't want to say the center of dentistry because I don't want people to think like that's where the best dentistry is necessarily, but it's the center of at least the thought of where dentistry
Mhm.
is
Yeah.
controlled in the
Yeah.
United States.
My concern though is, I share your feelings about ADA and, they're mostly positive. And what I would say too is that I think SERP needs to be very careful because it's my understanding that they've been clamping down more and more and more about how speakers like you and I can speak to products. Now, for anybody listening who doesn't know Kyle and I personally, we're very ethical people. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of there are some people that aren't ethical in this world,
Right.
and it's those bad apples that have caused organizations like SERP to have to clamp down further. However, there's even a move afoot that has not been approved yet, but there's even a move afoot to disallow a speaker to share their contact information with the audience. Now, that's absurd because the way this works is as follows. A big meeting like Chicago Midwinter, et cetera, would call up a speaker like Kyle or myself, and they don't have the financial resources when you're talking about literally dozens and dozens and dozens of speakers, probably over 100, to pay us what would be commensurate with our time and experience. So speakers like Kyle and I have additional corporate sponsors like Care Credit or Weave or implant companies, et cetera, that help us foot the bill for the travel expenses. And
Hmm.
so oftentimes it's not like trust me, we're not getting a huge payday for speaking at these meetings, quite the opposite. And so it's like this catch 22 situation that the profession's about to face. Because if SERP continues to clamp down and disallows even product mention or speaker contact information mention, well, how is it going to be beneficial to a company to support somebody like me who then is going to start to say, no, I can't go because I can't have this experience cost me money. It's got to at least be cost neutral. And so I think that's something a lot of dentists don't actually know about how this stuff actually works.
Can you explain what SERP is, ADA
Yeah.
SERP, and how that
So,
what that is, how it works?
yeah, it's the governing body that oversees CE credit. And so it's separate from the AGD. And so, somebody like me runs into challenges all the time because those who've listened to a bunch of episodes of ours, you might have heard my concept of dental dualism, which is the idea that we think all we need to do is focus on practice management and clinical topics and we'll be successful in practice when there's all this other stuff going on, which I'm sure we'll get to. And so In the descriptions, there are rules, which is understandable. For the objectives, there are rules, which is understandable. But in some cases, for somebody like myself who teaches soft skills, leadership skills, mental wellness skills, in some cases, they don't want to provide credit because it's not viewed as eligible slash valuable. For those watching on YouTube, I'm doing, for those not watching on YouTube, I'm using air quotes, to provide CE credit to. And, as you say, Kyle, dentistry is what we do, not who we are. And so I think everybody can tell I have pretty staunch feelings about this stuff because what we offer is valuable.
Well, it goes back to this archaic idea that you're not becoming a better dentist unless you're learning something clinically.
Right.
And you
Yep.
and I know this. We run
Yep.
masterminds, we do live events, we do online courses,
Mhm.
we interact with thousands of dentists around
Yeah.
the world, and we've helped them with mental wellness. Most of them don't suffer with clinical dentistry.
Yeah. It's
Now,
true.
yes, there's cases where the crown falls off, the tooth gets sensitive, the implant doesn't integrate right. Yeah, those complications do happen. But when we get people, like when you get people in for your coaching or when they come into my mastermind, which you very graciously are usually there for, um, we're not usually talking about clinical dentistry. We're
No.
usually saying, how do I have this conversation with my hygienist that is coming in 15 minutes late?
Yep.
Or my front office needs to take a shower. How do I talk to him or her about doing this? Or
Yep.
I'm struggling from a financial standpoint. How do I understand what my overhead is and read a P&L? And it's no wonder why most of us aren't suffering with clinical problems because that's all we focus on. We go to school for 8, 10, 12 years just doing
Yeah.
clinical. We get out of school. All of our CE is focused on clinical CE, how to get better doing implants, veneers, crowns, fillings, whatever.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
then we wonder why I'm so sad, why I'm so frustrated, why I'm having this inability to cope with what's happening. When you take a dentist that is already good clinically and you give them the training that you or I or others give that are non-clinical, they kick ass. I mean,
Hmm.
they can completely change
Yep.
how they show up. They can even become a better clinical dentist by learning something non-clinical.
Yep, 100%. And the research is clear. And for those of you who heard my keynotes, I talk about this research about how the science of optimism and positivity helps you see things better, diagnose more effectively. It increases your overall cognition to end up dealing, to be able to filter through facts and make decisions. So this stuff isn't fluff, and it's not all doom and gloom. I mean, we do have companies out there like Care Credit and Dental Warranty and Weave that, have stepped up, that have supported people like me, people like you, Kyle, and others, because they do understand how important this is. And shoot, what about Glidewell, who's opened up their home, so to speak, to us with open arms for us to be able to hold Lightside Live, our in-person course, in their facility. I don't. We've talked about this before, but I don't believe that would have happened pre-COVID or had it not been for COVID.
Yeah.
Period.
Well, you have things like in ADA, AGD approved courses, you have self-improvement as a
Yeah.
category.
Yeah.
And I don't know
Yeah.
if most people know that. So
Yep.
that's actually pretty awesome that we have
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And
It's
just that alone shows that at least ADA CERP and the governing body
mhm.
understands that self-improvement makes you a better dentist.
Yeah. And so does AGD. They have that as well. The self-improvement category. And so, it's something that um, is just so needed. And as I say so many times, it's like, look, you're exactly where you are today for a reason. And you've gotten to where you are today because of your skill set. And with many dentists, because as you've shared with me, we're 2.5 times more likely to suffer from anxiety, depression, and panic disorder. Take anxiety, for example. Some anxiety has pushed us to become better dentists because we are
Right?
concerned and anxious, to use a word, that we're going to be able to perform adequately and excel. Therefore, it causes us to be super prepared, et cetera, et cetera. But what ends up happening with this kind of, shall we say, habit of the mind is that sometimes it can end up become into an overuse situation, and that's when it becomes a problem. That's when the anxiety that has served you to do a better job as a dentist from a clinical perspective now gets transformed and mutated into every Sunday night you get the Sunday scaries, and then Monday morning you get a little nauseous when you get into your car. It hurts my heart when I hear that because there is another way. We don't have to live that way, you know?
Yeah. What's been nice over the last, I would say, 5 years, and I think a lot of it had to do with the COVID epidemic or pandemic, is that people in general, not just dentists,
Mhm.
are realizing that there is another way to life.
Yeah.
So you see a lot of self-improvement on it. I mean, maybe it's just my algorithm, but a lot of self-improvement
Yeah.
in books,
Mhm.
in influencers, quote unquote, in online resources, happening on game shows. I mean,
Yeah.
every type of media is incorporating self-improvement. And
Mhm.
I think back in the 80s or the 90s or even the early 2000s, my view of self-improvement was you couldn't, you just can't handle it. Something's wrong with
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
And what I realized was I just hadn't hit that spot yet.
Hmm.
There's this idea of a midlife crisis. And I feel like I went through that. But now looking back on it, I think a midlife crisis really is getting far enough into your life to have the self-awareness to know what's important.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you're weak. It means you've been strong for too long.
Hmm. And don't forget too, I'll prove your point about it wasn't just that society looked at these kind of things as there was something wrong with you. They literally made it as something wrong with you. And what I mean by that is this, both on dentistry and medicine, when you were applying, oh, also lawyers too. When you applied for a license, if you disclosed that you had mental health challenges or were on medications or whatever else, in certain states, you actually had trouble getting a license. So it
So true.
literally was viewed as a problem versus what it really was, which was a person who identified that they needed some help, sought the help, which is a huge
Virtuous.
example of
Yeah.
strength, right?
Yes.
And went out and got the health and then shared it to be transparent with the organizing body. And then they go, oh, yeah, sorry you told us that, but you're not as good as everybody else. So it wasn't just a feeling, it was literally ingrained into our licensure process, which is incredibly unfortunate and just maddening sitting where we sit today in 2025.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because I still have dentists that reach out to me and are worried about getting into therapy, getting on
Hmm.
medication because they still think that there is a
Yep.
problem with their license. And most states and countries now don't have these regulations because
Correct.
I think people have kind of come to their senses. But I
Yeah.
still have people, and they tend to be older doctors, so maybe that's
Yeah.
why they remember when it was stigmatized and you didn't go on medication because if you did, you had to disclose it. And if you did that, then maybe they could do something with your
Yep.
license or it could be public knowledge of some type. And I think now we've gotten to a point in all of society, but in dentistry as well, where people are seeing the vulnerability as being strength. I know
Yeah.
when I first started in 2018 talking about this and posting about it, I was scared, really, to post about it. I was
Mhm.
scared. I did it because I feel like I needed to, and I got so much support. Now,
Yeah.
I still did get people, like I remember one guy, he was a lab technician, and I wish I could remember which person it was, because I would love to talk with him. But he said, like, stop being a pussy. I remember that
Mm.
was the comment on my Facebook. So, of course, I did get some hate, right?
Yeah.
But overwhelmingly, it was, wow, Cal, thank you for talking about this. I've been going through this, or my partner went through this, or my, associate is going through this, or I had a student that committed suicide, blah, blah, blah. There was so much support from my vulnerability. And I think that we've now realized that when you look at people like Mel Robbins
Hmm.
or Brene Brown,
Yep.
they are perceived as being so strong because they were so weak.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. It's there. There's always strength in putting your hand up and saying, I have a problem, or I've been, through this journey and I want to help other people. And it's from that standpoint, I'm glad we're living in the times that we're living in, despite the fact that there's still huge stigmas around all this stuff. Anyway,
Martin, can you talk about the financial component to mindset shifts, to positivity, to happiness? I know you have some research on what Google is doing and some of these
yeah.
other multi-billion dollar industries and how they're incorporating this.
Yeah, so I actually just did an article recently on from burnout to brilliance, the truth of mindset and coaching. And so there's been a couple different interesting examples of this about certain large companies like Google and Microsoft that have, incorporated kind of mindfulness and mindset practices into the employee experience that have gained in profitability dramatically. The thing that's interesting about Google, and I think you were leading me toward like Project Aristotle, was that it started out kind of very differently. Because what they were trying to do originally was figure out what were the individual attributes that made a potential hire a good choice. And so, what they very quickly discovered by studying 100 groups over the course of a year, so a couple thousand people, was that it actually had less to do with the individual attributes and more about how the people fit into the group as a whole. And one of their conclusions was that and under was structure and clarity was pivotal. Understanding what your expectations are and the consequences of not upholding those expectations were key for the team's effectiveness. And what I've seen in dental practices over and over again, and this is a little bit of a veer off from the question around mindset, is that we don't, in many practices, have structure and clarity. And a doc might look at me and go, what do you mean? Of course we do. I'm like, no, you don't. Do we have defined job descriptions? Do we have defined job duties? Are we meeting quarterly to assess how we're doing and how we can improve? If the answer to any of those is no, then you don't have structure and clarity. And what then follows from structure and clarity is people's feeling of safety, or as Amy Edmondson calls it, psychological safety, so that when things go south, people feel safe enough to put their hand up and say, hey, listen, Houston, we got a problem, without fear of reprisal, judgment, or anything that could happen untoward at a later date. So having this openness to be able to talk about this stuff becomes critically important to the financial and business success of any enterprise. Forget about dentistry, but to any enterprise out there, period.
Well, this morning on another podcast, I was interviewing JJ Gomez, who is one of the implementers, one of the partners in digital smile design. So he's gone around to 130 different practices and basically
Mhm.
helped them build their practice and grow their
Mhm.
practice and organize and incorporate digital smile design. And I asked him, what do you think is the biggest problem that you see in dental offices? And he said, I think it's a toxic environment and team
Yeah.
cohesion. And I
Yeah.
immediately thought of you because this is what you go around and teach people. And I
Yeah.
think that it's crazy when you have someone like him who has literally helped 130 practices and probably
Mhm.
been in hundreds of practices.
Yeah.
For him to not, most dentists listening are probably going to say, what's the biggest problem? Oh, your matrix on your filling, is not tight enough or you're not getting a
Mhm.
contact. No, he said it's team atmosphere.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And one of the things that I haven't even talked about on this podcast before that I'm about to bring into kind of my toolkit is a scientific assessment called the Drake assessment. And over 500,000 people have taken this, and it can be used to actually figure out talk about problems of dentistry. If you asked a dentist, what's the biggest problem with hiring somebody, you will hear the following answer or something like it, which is, well, I don't know if they're going to fit in. Well, now there's an assessment that is accredited by the EEOC
And who is
for
that?
to be used. Yeah, that's the Employment Commission, the federal government,
Got
to
it.
be able to use in hiring for dental personnel.
Wow.
So if you have a top candidate, you can actually have your incumbent team take this assessment, compare it to the person that we think is the right fit, and see from a scientifically evidence-based hint hint perspective, does this person have a high likelihood of fitting into the team and being able to hit the ground running? And so I'm really excited about that because that's been a huge Achilles heel of dentists because so many of us don't know how to interview, don't know how to ask the right questions, don't know how to
Well, we were
hire.
never taught this, right, Martin?
No,
So
exactly. It's
it's
not our
like you can't
fault.
expect us to know
Yeah.
this stuff, but that's not an excuse not to learn it. A lot
This
of
is
people
true.
say, well, I didn't learn this stuff, so that's why I'm
Yeah.
bad at interviewing.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, if you've had that realization, if you've
Yeah.
had that self-awareness that you are bad at it,
Yeah.
let's look inside or outside of dentistry
Hmm.
and try
Hmm.
to find resources
Yeah.
on what is the best way to do this. Because you say this all the time, besides working at the chair, everything else that we do is not special. So if
Yep.
you think a dental interview is so much different than a corporate interview or than someone interviewing someone at a restaurant, no,
Nope.
it's the same thing. And
Yep.
so we need to understand, we need to have this realization, we need to identify. I'm kind of going through my my framework, but it makes sense almost in everything. Realize, identify, and then take the steps to spend the
Yep.
time, effort, and money to realize what we may not be sufficient in. And it's crazy how when people put this effort into this, they
Hmm.
get better.
Oh yeah.
They become better interviewers. That means they get better team members. That means their team may stay longer. That means they have less problems with turnover. That means financially they're better, which may mean that they take more time off, which may mean that they spend more time with their kids, which may, I mean, if you just think it's one little aspect, it is all connected.
Hmm.
But it
Well,
all
and
starts with that awareness.
the other thing I was talking to Doc at Midwinter too, about this exact topic, which was interviewing. I looked at him and I said, "You know what? The other thing that getting good at interviewing does for you?" And he goes, "What?" I said, "It teaches you how to ask better questions."
Hmm.
I said, "So it helps you as a leader with your team. It helps you as I'll call it lead clinician with your patients
Hmm.
to understand how to ask more effective, more open-ended questions to really get to the heart of the matter." So what I would say is, interestingly enough, interviewing isn't an isolated skill just for the hiring process. It's actually a skill that can be deployed in a multitude of ways and fashions.
And if we boil it all down, everything, how you get better at this, it's being a better communicator.
Yep,
But how many dentists
100%.
do you know that are like, I'm taking a communication course or I'm putting effort on becoming a better communicator? But
Hmm.
when you
Hmm.
see the dentists that have worked on this, that understand
Yeah.
frameworks, that have utilized this, that understand how to ask questions right, how to ask open-ended questions, a lot of what you teach, they thrive.
Yeah.
Completely changes their life, their practice. I've been lucky enough in the tech world to meet some very successful CEOs, founders, people that are worth eight, nine figures, very, very successful people. And what you find with them is they most of the time ask questions.
Yep.
They're not coming, I mean, sometimes they're coming with a great idea, but when they're talking to an employee, to another founder, to a colleague, to a peer, they sit and ask questions before they make a statement.
Yeah. 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 Because they've been around the block enough to know that by continuing to talk without asking further questions, you can actually box yourself into a corner.
That's so true. And this works. Listen, if you're a good communicator, that means you're a good communicator with your patients, with your
Hmm.
team, with your
Yeah.
spouse, with your kids. I mean,
Yeah.
I realized early in my parenting journey that I was a bad communicator. That was actually a few years, that was like a year before I started going on to my self-improvement journey. But not that I'm some amazing parent now. I still have a lot of mistakes. I've made every mistake possible. But I've become better at
Yeah.
parenting by working on my communication for dentistry. Even
Yeah.
just like questions, like let's say you need to have your kid clean up their room. So if I came to my son and said, Valco, clean up your room. We have people coming over in an hour. You need to do this right now because I'm your dad.
Yeah.
Or if I came to him and said, Valco, I heard that Steph Curry can clean up his room in 5 minutes. Do you think you can do it faster than Steph Curry? That's like his idol right now, right? What do you think's gonna work better?
Yeah, totally. Well, interestingly enough, I had this conversation yesterday. Um, it got posted on Dental Nachos. You saw it. Somebody who chose to post anonymously set up an appointment with me, and we were talking. And this individual was going into kind of a new practice situation, et cetera. And this topic came up, and I said to this person, I said, "Listen," I said, "which sounds better? Are you going to mentor me to the senior doctor, or what does mentorship look like to you?"
Oh, that's great.
And so we had this conversation that went in a way that I hadn't even thought of before, which is this. The question of, are you going to mentor me, is actually putting a judgment and an expectation. So
Sure.
not only is it a closed-ended question that's a yes or no answer, but you're bringing an emotional component on top of it and a judgmental expectation versus, what does mentorship look like to you? Or what
Mm.
are your thoughts on mentoring me? And so this individual and I had a really good conversation about that and how to handle these kind of conversations and so forth.
It's intentional communication.
Yeah.
Most of our communication that most of us do is by habit, it is by
Hmm.
feel. There's no rhyme or reason to it. But imagine that you're going in to prep a crown. And, everyone listening to this has probably prepped a crown, but most of the time, let's say you start with reducing the occlusal. And then you go to the axial walls. And then you check that your taper is right. And then you check blah, 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 that your margins are good, whatever. You have a system that you do it. But let's say you're just willy-nilly. I'm just going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, and oh, I'll do the mesial, then I'll go back to the distal, then I'll do the...
Hmm.
It's not going to turn out as you're not being intentional with what you do. And
Correct.
people think that communication should just be fly by the seat of their pants. But the best communicators are thinking about this. They've learned frameworks. They understand, like that question that you just gave. It's
Hmm.
such a great example. But I think it
Hmm.
comes down to intentional communication.
Oh yeah, 100%. Couldn't agree with you more. Yeah.
So today we've talked about what's happening in dentistry based on what we've seen in the last few weeks, what's been going on at live events. Are live events growing? Are they shrinking? I think the jury's still out on that. I think that you and I are still doing a lot of live events, so we are all over the place, and I think you get the probably the best value in live events. I
Yeah.
think people learn better in a live event, and that comes from two people that both have online courses. So,
Yeah.
um, but I think when you and I have interaction in our live events, people get better results
Oh,
for sure.
100%. And I think I think the jury's particularly still out for the larger scale events that are just so cost prohibitive to the supporting industry partners involved. I don't think live events are going anywhere. I think the
No,
question is, how do the really bigger events that aren't as,
good point.
so well done, like, Chicago or CDA or
Yeah.
Yankee or Hinman, how, or Star of the North, how they're going to do, long term.
Yeah. So we've also talked about ADA CERP, CE credits, what's changing with the involvement of companies. Nobody
Hmm.
wants every CE that you take to be a sales pitch, of course.
Yep.
But we do have to think about how these, speakers don't speak for free. And
Right.
just like, you dentists listening don't prep crowns and place implants for free, right? I mean, it is a
Exactly.
job just like anything
Yeah.
else. So we have to think
Exactly.
about how's that going to change, what's changing with that. There are some changing of the tides that's happening there. And lastly, we talked about mindset, the incorporation of mental health training into dentistry, which of course Martin and I are very bullish on and have been involved with from the beginning. So we hope that this was really educational, a little different than some of
Yep.
our previous episodes, but I hope that it was a nice little change. Now, if you'd like to learn from us in person, again, go to wellnessanddentistry.com, click on links, and you can find our Lightside Live course that's happening May 9th and 10th in Irvine, California. You're 20 minutes away from Disneyland. You're 20 minutes away from the best beaches in California, where I live. And so you should come and hang out with us. We're super fun, and you get 12 CE credits, so you might as well. Thanks everybody for listening to Wellness and Dentistry, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Bye bye.